This is Lesson 1112, The Beginning of the Cold War. Central questions: what was the Cold War? And what led to the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union? Here's a really different map that gives us a unique perspective on the Cold War. We're looking at the situation from the North Pole. The USA after World War II. The end of World War II in 1945 marked a turning point in U.S. history because the U.S. started taking a more active role in world affairs. The USA became a leader in the United Nations and the World Bank, and the U.S. occupied and helped rebuild Japan after the war. The U.S. helped found Israel as a Jewish nation in the Middle East. This map here shows the United Nations member nations, and they're in light blue. As you can see, it's almost everything. The United Nations headquarters is in New York City. Here is Israel, here is the Middle East, and here is a picture of the globe that shows the entire Middle East in orange. The American occupation of Japan. This is a photograph of Douglas MacArthur next to the Emperor Hirohito. This photograph was circulated among the Japanese people, and it was psychologically devastating because it showed their great emperor as a little man next to Douglas MacArthur. The Cold War. The most important change in U.S. foreign policy after World War II was the beginning of the Cold War. People have different opinions as to when it started and when it ended. But I'm going to say that the Cold War was an era of distrust and hostility between the USA and the USSR from about 1947 to about 1991, when the USSR ceased to exist. It was an era of competing ideologies. The USA promoted democracy and capitalism and free markets, while the USSR tried to spread communism. Examining Cold War ideologies. Like we said, the Cold War was a conflict of ideology between the United States and the Soviet Union. So we're going to examine 8 definitions on our chart. What are the Soviet criticisms of democracy, capitalism, freedom, and individualism? And what are the U.S. criticisms of socialism, totalitarianism, equality, and collectivism? So on one side of the Cold War, you have capitalism. And a definition of a capitalist ideology might go like this: all industry, business, and agriculture should be owned by private people or firms. Competition between rival factories or shops or farms will cause prices to fall and make firms more efficient. And the values that go along with that ideology are, for example, any person should be free to start a business and employ people. And any profit that he or she makes is a reward for hard work. Average standard of living higher than under communism, but widespread between rich and poor. Opportunity for all. A free economy. And the choice of many parties for government chosen by the people. A democracy. On the other side of the Cold War, you have the ideology of communism. Everything belongs to the state and should be run by the government on behalf of the people. A classless society achieved by overthrowing capitalism by revolution. So some values that go along with that ideology would be: no private person should be allowed to profit from the work of other citizens. All profits, instead of going into the pockets of one owner or even shareholders, goes to the state, and everyone benefits. Lower average standard of living, but in theory, everyone is equal. Fairness and equality for all. A controlled economy, and only one party of government. No need for any more. Causes of the Cold War. Remember that Vladimir Lenin led the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution in 1917. The USA sent troops to fight the Red Army on behalf of the White Army during the Russian Civil War. In the 1920s, Americans feared the spread of communism during the so-called Red Scare. After Lenin's death in 1924, Joseph Stalin became dictator of the USSR, and started his 5-year plans. During World War II, the USA and the USSR worked together to defeat the Axis powers. But World War II increased hostilities between the USA and the USSR. The US and the USSR emerged from the war as rival superpowers, and the development of the atomic bomb gave the USA a very short-lived monopoly on nuclear weapons. During the war, the USSR had occupied huge sections of Eastern Europe in order to fight Hitler, and the US likewise had occupied huge sections of Western Europe in order to fight Hitler. And when Hitler was finally defeated, neither the USSR nor the USA was in a hurry to pull their troops out of those territories just yet. Superpower aims in Europe. For the United States, it was encourage democracy in other countries to help prevent the rise of communist governments, gain access to raw materials and markets to fuel booming industries, rebuild European governments to promote stability and create new markets for U.S. goods, and finally, reunite Germany to stabilize it and increase the security of Europe. But the Soviet Union had very different aims. Encourage communism in other countries as part of a worldwide workers' revolution. Rebuild its war-ravaged economy using Eastern Europe's industrial equipment and raw materials. Control Eastern Europe to protect Soviet borders and balance the U.S. influence in Western Europe. That's very important. And finally, keep Germany divided to prevent its waging war again. At the Yalta Conference, Stalin agreed to allow self-determination to these countries in Eastern Europe. In other words, to let them choose their own form of government. But Stalin never did that. By the time of the Potsdam Conference, Stalin began extending his control over Eastern Europe. Stalin refused to remove his military or allow free elections in Eastern Europe. And as a result, Eastern European nations turned to communism and became Soviet satellites, nations influenced by the USSR, and they would eventually be called the Eastern Bloc. Here's a map that hopefully explains a little bit about the situation that Germany was in. Germany was broken apart into 4 sectors among the 4 allies: Soviet Union, United Kingdom, France, and the United States. And each of these victorious allies had their own sector of Germany to administrate and their own sector of the capital city of Berlin to administrate. Another very interesting part of this city map here is you see where the Berlin Wall was, and it divided East Berlin and West Berlin. And you can see when it existed. It was built in 1961, and it started to come down in 1989. So what happened to Germany? The USSR decided to convert its sector into the country of East Germany. And the other 3 sectors, US, British, and French, became West Germany. Here's a cartoon of Stalin on behalf of his country, the Soviet Union, doing a massive land grab on behalf of communism. So there evolved an imaginary border between capitalism and democracy in the West and communism and totalitarianism in the East. And this imaginary line between East and West is what Winston Churchill, in a speech, called the Iron Curtain. The USA began to view Stalin in the 1940s as a new Hitler, a dangerous dictator who wanted to take over the world. In 1947, the U.S. began a policy of what they called containment to stop the spread of communism by the USSR. And it was defined by Secretary of State George Marshall this way: it's a long-term, patient but firm, and vigilant containment of Russian expansionist policies, which will eventually force the USSR to live in peace with the West. When the USSR began pressuring Greece and Turkey to turn communist, the USA created the Truman Doctrine: U.S. economic and military aid to any country threatened by communism. The Truman Doctrine worked, and neither Greece nor Turkey fell to communism. So the policy of containment had its first win in Greece and Turkey. European nations had difficulty recovering after World War II, which led to fears of communism in Europe. So the U.S. created the Marshall Plan and offered $13 billion to help rebuild post-war Europe, and anybody could apply for it, East or West. By 1952, Western Europe recovered, and communism never took root. So the Marshall Plan was the second way in which the policies of containment and the Truman Doctrine succeeded against communism. Containment was now 2-0 against communism. This map here gives you an idea of where Marshall Plan money went to aid Europe between 1948 and 1952. And you can see some of that money even went to Yugoslavia. In the year 1948, the USSR used military force to turn Czechoslovakia to communism, and this led to fears that Stalin would use similar tactics in Western Europe. In 1949, the United States formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance among democratic countries. NATO was one of many alliances that the USA would form with democratic nations over the course of the Cold War. Here's a map that shows, for example, CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization, that lasted from 1959 to 1979, and the South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty, signed in 1953, Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, ANZUS, the Australia-New Zealand-U.S. Defense Treaty, signed in 1951, SEATO, a very important one, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. It was signed in 1954, disbanded in 1977. We've already talked about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, signed in 1949, and the Rio Treaty, Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, signed in 1947. So the United States sought friends all over the world. The Berlin Airlift, a fourth test of containment. In 1948, the USSR responded to containment by cutting off all traffic to the city of Berlin in East Germany, a country they had created out of their sector. The USA began the Berlin Airlift to bring food, fuel, and supplies to keep its territory, West Berlin, from falling to communism. The standoff lasted 11 months until Stalin finally lifted the blockade. Hopefully this map explains the situation with Berlin that we're talking about. Europe was divided east and west between the communists and the democracies. The former German capital of Berlin was also divided between east and west, although it was completely inside Eastern Europe. In other words, we had a significant piece of territory inside and completely surrounded by the communist bloc. The Soviet Union didn't think that the Western powers had the ability to supply all of West Berlin's needs by air, and that the city would be starved into submission. From June 1948 to May of 1949, Allied planes took off and landed every 3 minutes in West Berlin. On 278,000 flights, pilots brought 2.3 million tons of food, fuel, medicine, and even Christmas gifts to the people of West Berlin. Reorganizing the government. By 1947, the U.S. government created 3 new agencies during the Cold War: the Department of Defense to direct the Army and Navy, the military created the new Air Force, the Central Intelligence Agency to collect and manage information among all government agencies, and the National Security Council to advise the President on national security. The new Air Force was the preferred military agency of the Cold War because airplanes could drop nuclear bombs if needed. The Cold War expands. The nuclear arms race. The U.S. monopoly on nuclear weapons technology ended in 1949 when the USSR successfully tested their own atomic bomb. The Soviet atomic bomb motivated the USA to regain its nuclear advantage. In 1952, the U.S. tested the first hydrogen bomb, 1,000 times more powerful than the atom bomb. Soviets responded with their own hydrogen bomb in 1953. The Cold War in Asia. Containment did well stopping communism in Europe, as we've just seen. But by the late 1940s, the Cold War spread to Asia. Since the 1930s, communist Mao Zedong fought democratic leaders for control of China. And in 1941, Mao gained control and turned China to communism. Americans blamed President Truman for, quote, losing China. America's response to the fall of China was to more aggressively confront communism in the world. The U.S. expanded the military and stockpiled nuclear weapons. The USA feared that China would influence its neighbors to turn communist, and this fear was called the domino theory. The idea behind the domino theory was that if one country turned communist, that country would be like a domino, pushing the dominoes next to it, and thus spreading communism. In 1950, the U.S. fought the Korean War to stop communism. Here's a map of North and South Korea, and there's a timeline to show how the Korean War started. After World War II, Korea was divided along what was called the 38th parallel, with communists in the north and democracy in the south. In 1950, North Korea crossed that 38th parallel and attacked South Korea. The USA led a United Nations intervention to stop North Korea. But when the USA pushed too close to China, the Chinese army entered the war and helped North Korea. By 1953, a ceasefire stopped the fighting, and the 38th parallel was restored as the boundary between North and South Koreas. The USA stopped the spread of communism into South Korea. But in the year 1954, Communist Ho Chi Minh began a war to gain independence for Vietnam. Conclusions. After World War II, the U.S. foreign policy changed. The U.S. became a superpower that actively intervened in world affairs. The Cold War increased military spending, nuclear weapons, and fears of a war with the USSR. President Truman successfully contained communism in Europe, but seemed to fail in Asia.